Hi everyone, this is the fifth video in the series Introduction to Literary Theory, and the topic of this video is reader response criticism. So most academic criticism is centered on the text, the idea being that literary works contain certain meanings which it is the critic's job to uncover. Reader response criticism decenters the text and examines the reader's role in the production of meaning. The risk of such an approach, of course, is that it can become entirely subjective, focusing so much on the experience of the individual reader that an objective or shared understanding of the text becomes irrelevant, if not impossible, which would seem to fly in the face of the very idea of academic inquiry. If the only truth that matters is one's own personal experience of the text or one's own interpretation of it, what then is the point of studying literature in the academy at all? So there are two ways reader response criticism can avoid relinquishing the text and subsiding into pure subjectivism. Transaction theory, which is identified with Louise Rosenblatt, and the reception theory of Hans Robert Jauss. Both of these theories, they're very, very similar. They overlap in lots of ways, but the main idea is the focus on the reading process, how texts shape readers' experiences, and in turn, how readers themselves supplement the meaning of texts. So let's take a look at some of the key figures in reader response criticism and their work. There's Louise Rosenblatt, looking very jovial. She lived a very long time, 1904 to 2005, and this is her major book. Her work on this really began in the 1960s. She had an article towards a transactional theory of reading, but all of this coalesced into her major work, The Reader, the Text, the Poem, the Transactional Theory of the Literary Work, 1978. And as you can see from the title of both of these works, the word transaction, the idea that reading is a transaction between text and reader. We'll come back to transaction theory a little bit later. So here is Walker Gibson, also a long-lived critic, who wrote an important article back in 1950 called Authors, Speakers, Readers, and Mock Readers. And this idea that the text, that the literary text constructs a reader, will connect with the idea of implied readers that we'll talk about a little bit later. So he's considered a major figure in the development of reader response theory. I couldn't find a good picture of Wolfgang Iser, but he is hugely important. He has two books that had a huge impact on reader response theory. The first one is The Implied Reader, and we'll talk more about that term in a little bit, but this book was published in 1972, and then an English translation of it appeared in 1974. And then the book you see pictured here, The Act of Reading, A Theory of Aesthetic Response, which appeared in 1976 and was translated into English in 1978. And related to Wolfgang Iser is this man, Hans Robert Jauss, controversial figure because it was discovered, I'm not sure if it was discovered before he died or after he passed away, but he was a member of the Nazi Party and the SS and was guilty of war crimes. But I don't think when I don't think anyone knew that when these books appeared. Aesthetic Experience in Literary Hermeneutics in 1982, and then a book that's kind of connected to it, Toward an Aesthetic of Reception, and the idea that that he's most well known for today is the idea of the horizon of expectations, which we'll talk about as well. Some more recent works in this field: Norman Holland, who just passed away a few years ago as of the making of this video, whose most famous book in reader response theory is titled Five Readers Reading, which appeared in 1975, and he focuses heavily on psychology, the psychology of the reader. So perhaps the most subjectivist of all of the reader response theorists. And then another individual, Stanley Fish, who's still alive. I think he's the only one of this group still alive today. And his major contribution to this area is the book, Is There a Text in This Class? The Authority of Interpretive Communities. And that term, interpretive community, is important. We'll talk about interpretive communities in a moment. And this book appeared in 1980. So we'll talk about transaction theory and reception theory. Again, in traditional literary criticism, the idea that it's all about the text is at the center, and with reader response theory, the text is considered in relationship to a readership. And transaction and reception theory both play on the idea that there's this mutual influence. It becomes kind of a chicken and egg thing. So there are ways that the text shapes the reader. And two terms mentioned in our textbook that I think are particularly important in this regard is the idea of grammar. And what grammar means in this context is not like, punctuation or sentence syntax, but the rules and structures and conventions that that sort of shape the audience. So thinking about the grammar, how do the structures of the text, the breakage of a text, for example, like the division of a play into acts and scenes, or books into chapters, or even the format of a text. How do those affect and shape the reading experience? And the conventions of certain genres. We could add the conventions of certain genres to that as well. And then in addition to the grammar and how the grammar of a literary text shapes its reader or shapes its audience, there's also this idea then of the implied reader, or the reader that an author imagines when he or she creates a literary work, and how they address the reader or define the reader, or try to manipulate or control the reader's experiences of the text. So this idea of the implied reader, that's a concept that comes from Wolfgang Iser. The flip side of this, of course, is that readers shape texts. And a couple of terms here. One of them is interpretive communities. This comes from Stanley Fish. And the idea here is that readers have shared prejudices, values, or experiences that shape the way they interpret or respond to literary texts, and that it's important to try to understand those. And Stanley Fish didn't really believe in a purely subjective reader response. He believed that all individual responses were shaped by communities of readers based on, say, for example, race or social class or educational level, that that readers could be grouped or classed according to certain identity markers or shared experiences, and that all these things would shape the way that they interpret texts. And so he called them interpretive communities. And sort of a related concept to this is horizon of expectations, and this goes to the reception theory of Hans Robert Jauss, and the idea that we can look historically at different groups of readers. Say, for example, who was reading poetry in 1819, and what kinds of expectations did a reader have looking at poetry at that time. So reception theory is a little more historically oriented, trying to understand or reconstruct the interpretive communities of the past, and what their expectations were, and how those expectations shaped their responses to different writers, different works of literature. And this is the basic idea of reader response theory. And that concludes this video.